I'm Geetha Gurumuthy, live at Westminster, where a crucial showdown in the House of Commons over Brexit is fast approaching. Boris Johnson squares up to his own MPs who are trying to block a no-deal Brexit. They remain defiant despite his threats.
I am going to defend my party against incomers, entryists who are trying to turn it from a broad church into a narrow faction.
Downing Street says if they lose the vote in Parliament, Boris Johnson will push for a snap election in mid-October. The atmosphere here is intense as we head towards what's likely to be one of the most tumultuous parliamentary sessions in years. That's all coming up on Impact. Welcome to Westminster. We're just changing our normal scheduling because we are staying with developments here in Westminster as MPs from the British Prime Minister's own party look set to join forces with opposition MPs to try to block a no-deal Brexit. If he's defeated, the Prime Minister has threatened to try and call the UK's third general election in 4 years, which could come as soon as the middle of next month. That move also could be blocked by rebels who are fearful that there could be shenanigans by the government to try and force through a no-deal exit at the end of October. Well, in the next few minutes, we are expecting Boris Johnson to make a statement about his visit last month to the G7. That should be in at the House of Commons. We're just keeping an eye on the House of Commons for you. We have got those pictures coming into us live. Let's talk to Rob Watson about what is likely to emerge in the next few moments, in the next few hours, Rob.
Well, in the next few moments, we're going to have Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, making a statement about, seems like an awful long time ago, I know, but the G7 summit in Biarritz. And I'm not sure if we're looking at any pictures of Parliament now, but it's one of those extraordinary moments where an MP who won a recent by-election is being sworn in, swearing allegiance to the Queen. So in a weird sort of way, the kind of, the normal politics goes on, and yet this is going to be anything but a normal day, because what we're likely to see, what we're expecting to see, is MPs taking control of the parliamentary agenda away from the government in order to do what? To affect the most important issue in British politics, and that is Brexit, with their effort, which we think there's going to succeed in trying to outlaw a no-deal Brexit.
Let's hear from the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, before I begin, I'm sure that the whole House will join me in remembering that it is 80 years today that this country entered the Second World War. And it is, of course, true that the horror of that conflict surpasses all modern controversies. It's also true that this country still stands, then as now, for democracy, for the rule of law, for the fight against racial and religious hatred. And, Mr. Speaker, I know that this whole House is united in defending those values around the world. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'll make a statement about the G7 summit in Biarritz. As I speak, vast tracts of the Amazon rainforest are on fire. Free trade is in retreat. 130 million girls worldwide are not in education. Our oceans are being foully polluted. And so it's never been more important for global Britain to use our voice as an agent for change and progress. Yeah. Only by exerting our influence at a global level, only by sticking up for our values and our beliefs, that we can create the international context for Britain to prosper and to ensure that this is the greatest place on earth, as an engine of prosperity and progress that has lifted billions out of poverty. And yet the reality is that trade as a share of the world economy has been stagnant for the last decade. In the Leaders' Declaration, the G7 unanimously endorsed open and fair world trade, and we're determined to reform the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and reach agreement next year to simplify regulatory barriers. Britain is on the verge, Mr. Speaker, of taking back control of our trade policy and restoring our independent seat in the WTO for the first time in 46 years. Our exports to the our exports to the United States. I wish my honourable friend all the best.
Order! Resume your seat. Thank you, Prime Minister. Order! I ask the House to have some regard to how our proceedings are viewed by people outside the chamber. I will always facilitate the expression of opinion by this House. Order! Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is making a statement, and that statement should be heard, and he will be heard, as will every other member. End of subject. The Prime Minister.
Thank you. Britain is on the verge of taking back control of our trade policy, as I say, Mr. Speaker. On the verge, and we could achieve even more in our trade with the United States by using the powers we will regain to do a comprehensive free trade deal. A deal in which both President Trump and I have agreed that the NHS is not on the table. And unlike some in the House, I consider the United States to be a natural ally and a force for good in the world. And I recoil from the visceral, juvenile anti-Americanism that would do such profound damage to this country's interests. Mr. Speaker, I know that the whole House will share my concern about the gravity of the situation in Hong Kong. As a nation with a deep belief in freedom of expression and assembly, we stand firm in upholding Hong Kong's way of life, guaranteed by one country, two systems. And I welcome the unwavering support of my G7 counterparts on this vital matter. Mr. Speaker, the UK is at the forefront of a new campaign to end the tragic loss of species around the world. We cannot bequeath a planet where the Sumatran tiger and the African elephant and entire ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef live in the shadow of destruction. So I'm delighted that the G7 accepted UK proposals for more ambitious targets to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. Britain is responsible for 2.6 million square miles of ocean, the fifth largest maritime estate in the world. Our Blue Belt programme will ensure that marine protected areas encompass 1.5 million square miles, and at the G7 I announced a further £7 million for this vital effort. I also announced another £10 million to protect the rainforest in Brazil, where 41,000 fires have raged so far this year, more than twice as many in the same period in 2018. Britain is bidding to host the UN's 26th Climate Change Conference next year. If we succeed, we shall focus on solutions that harness the power of nature, including reforestation. And there is one measure that would address all those issues, Mr. Speaker. And if they think that's a waste of money, Mr. Speaker, I think that tells you all you need to know about the modern Labour Party. One measure that will address all those issues, and that is ensuring that every girl in the world receives the education that is her right. That would not only curb infant mortality, eradicate illiteracy and reduce population pressures, it would strike a blow for morality and justice. In Biarritz, the G7 therefore endorsed the UK's campaign for 12 years of quality education for every girl in the world. And I announced new funding for £90 million so that 600,000 children in countries torn by conflict, where girls are twice as likely as boys to be out of the classroom, get the chance to go to school. And as well as my G7 colleagues, I was delighted to meet other leaders, including President Ramaphosa of South Africa, Prime Minister Modi of India, Prime Minister Morrison of Australia, who heroically masked his emotions in the face of the historic innings of Ben Stokes. And in every conversation, I was struck by the enthusiasm of my colleagues to strengthen their relations with this country, whether on trade, security and defence, science and technology. Mr. Speaker, I was also able to use the G7 to follow up my conversations in Berlin and Paris with Chancellor Merkel and President Macron on Brexit, as well as with Prime Minister Conte, Prime Minister Sanchez and President Tusk. I have since spoken to Commission President Juncker and many other leaders, and I was able to make clear to them all that everyone in this government wants a deal. Yeah. But we do. But it is a reality that the House of Commons have rejected the current withdrawal agreement 3 times, and it simply cannot be resurrected. And that is why I wrote to President Tusk.
Order, Mr. Chairman. I look to you as a senior and distinguished elder statesman in the House to set an example of good behaviour, analogous to the Buddha-like calm of the Father of the House, which is exhibited at all times, the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is why I wrote to President Tusk on the 19th of August to set out our arguments why any future agreement must include the abolition of the anti-democratic backstop. We have also been clear, which is, by the way, is opposed on all sides of that. We have also been clear that we will need changes to the political declaration to clarify that our future relationship with the EU will be based on a free trade agreement and giving us full control over our regulations, our trade and our foreign and defence policy. This clarity has brought benefits. Far from jeopardising negotiations, it is making them more straightforward. In the last few weeks, I believe the chances of a deal have risen. This week, we are intensifying reflect that reality in their response. President Macron said, if, I quote, if...
Order! I want to hear everything said in the order. Well, I've never had any difficulty hearing the Prime Minister, but if it is necessary for him to speak up, I am certain... Order! I'm certain that he'll overcome his natural shyness in order to do so. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think they're willfully closing their ears to the reality that our friends and partners are increasingly seeing the possibilities of an agreement. I quote President Macron of France. If there are things, he said, which as part of what was negotiated by Michel Barnier can be adapted and are in keeping with the 2 objectives that I've mentioned, stability in Ireland, which we all support, and the integrity of the single market, we should identify them in the coming months. Is that the negative spirit of the opposition benches? No, it isn't. And speaking in Berlin of possible alternatives to the backstop, Chancellor Merkel of Germany said, once we see and say this could be a possible outcome, this could be a possible arrangement. This backstop is a sort of placeholder which is no longer necessary. She said. That's a positive spirit, which we are not, I'm afraid, hearing echoed on the other side of the House today. And I believe there are indeed, they're fleeing already, Mr. Speaker, to go to the beach, fleeing already. There are indeed solutions. They don't want to hear about solutions, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to hear about solutions, but they don't want to hear about a deal. There are practical arrangements that we can find which avoid anyone putting infrastructure on the Irish border, Mr. Speaker. And I say to the honourable members departing back, and he knows it well, these have been well worked out and involve measures such as trusted trader schemes, transit provisions, frontier zones, reduced bureaucracy for smaller local traders, and many others. In particular, we recognise, and I advise the members opposite to pay attention to what is being said. We recognise that for reasons of geography and economics, agri-food is increasingly managed on a common basis across the island of Ireland. We are ready to find ways forward that recognise this reality, provided it clearly enjoys the consent of all parties and institutions with an interest. We will also be discussing this with the EU shortly, and I will be discussing it with the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, when I see him in Dublin on Monday. Mr. Speaker, It is simply wrong. It is simply wrong to say we are not making progress. There is a lot to do in the coming days, but things are moving. And a major reason for that is that everyone can see that this government is utterly determined to leave the EU on October the 31st, come what may, without a deal if necessary. And that is why over the summer my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, has been leading the government's efforts 7 days a week to accelerate our national preparations for this possibility. And he will be making a statement on that subject shortly. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has made all the necessary funds available. We have already reached agreements with our partners to roll over trade deals worth around 89 billion of exports and imports. We have secured air services agreements around the world. We have increased the capacity of our border force, strengthened the resilience of our ports, bolstered our freight capacity, and worked with meticulous detail to ensure the uninterrupted supply of critical goods, including medicines. We will be ready, Mr. Speaker. We will be ready. Mr. Speaker, I returned from the G7 with real momentum in the Brexit discussions. I want to return from next month's European Council in a similar way, with a deal that this House can debate and scrutinise and endorse in time for our departure on October the 31st. But, Mr. Speaker, there is one step that would jeopardise all the progress that we have made in the G7 and around the capitals of Europe. And that is if this House were to decide what they want, to undermine our negotiation, to force us, that's what they want, to force us to beg for yet another pointless delay. If that happens, all the progress that we have been making will have been for nothing. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, a deal was published. A bill that the Leader of the Opposition has spent all summer working on. And this is not a bill in any normal sense of the word. It is without precedent in our history. It is a bill that, if passed, would force me to go to Brussels and beg an extension. It would force me to accept the terms offered. It would destroy any chance of negotiation for a new deal. It would destroy it. And indeed, it would enable our friends in Brussels to dictate the terms of the negotiation. That's what it does. There is only one way, Mr. Speaker, to describe this deal. It is Jeremy Corbyn's surrender bill. That's what it is. It means running up the white flag. The bill's shameful. It means running up the white flag. And I want to make clear to everybody in this House, there are no circumstances in which I will ever accept anything like it. I will never surrender the control of our negotiations in the way the Leader of the Opposition is demanding. Mr. Speaker,
Order. People mustn't keep ranting from a sedentary position. However long it takes, the statement will be heard and the response to it will be heard. That is the reality, and nothing can gainsay it. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we promised the people we would get Brexit done. We promised to respect the result of the referendum, and we must do so now. Enough is enough. The country wants this done, and they want the referendum respected. We are negotiating a deal. And though I am confident of getting a deal, we will leave by October the 31st in all circumstances. There will be no further pointless delay. This House has never before voted to force the Prime Minister to surrender such a crucial decision to the discretion of our friends and neighbours overseas. Because what this bill would mean is that unless we agree to the terms of our friends and partners, they would be able to keep us in the EU for as long as they want and on their terms. And I urge, therefore, this House to reject this bill tonight so that we can get the right deal for our country, deliver Brexit and take the whole country forward. And I commend this statement, Mr. Speaker, to the House. Thank you.
Order. For the avoidance of doubt, there is no vote on a bill tonight. There is a vote on a motion. And if that motion is successful, there would be a bill tomorrow. Order. I say this simply because the intelligibility of our proceedings to those observing them is important, and I'm sure everybody on all sides of the House would recognise that fundamental truth. The Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for an advanced copy of his statement. And I join with him in recognising the great human suffering of World War II, the great human bravery that took place during that war, in that awful conflict which began 80 years ago, but was essential in defeating the disgusting ideology of the Nazis and fascism at that time. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister met EU leaders over the summer and the EU Council President Tusk at the G7. After these meetings, the Prime Minister struck an optimistic note, saying the chances of a deal were, in his words, improving. His optimism was not shared by those who have been at the same meetings. The Prime Minister may claim progress is being made, but EU leaders report that the government has so far failed to present any new proposals. Can the Prime Minister clear this up? Can he tell us if the UK has put forward any new proposal in relation to the backstop? If so, will he publish them so that this reckless government only has one plan: to crash out of the EU without a deal? The reality is exposed today in the in-house journal of the Conservative Party, otherwise known as the Daily Telegraph, which reports the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff calling negotiations a sham. Reports that the strategy is to, quote, run down the clock, and that the proposal to alter the backstop is a complete fantasy. And those are the words of the Attorney General. No deal, Mr. Speaker, will mean food shortages, reduced medical supplies and chaos at our ports. Not me saying that. The government's own leaked analysis says, and it warns of chaos all across the board. Today, we had expected a publication of the government's no-deal preparations. This government is hiding from scrutiny, hiding from the people, and trying to hide us from their true intentions. This isn't just a government in chaos, but a government of cowardice. Thankfully, some in Whitehall are putting these vital documents into the public domain. But we shouldn't have to rely on sporadic leaks. So will the Prime Minister set out today when these documents will be published so that the people and Parliament can scrutinise and debate them? Many on the benches opposite would relish a no deal. They see it as an opportunity to open up Britain to a one-sided trade deal which puts us at the mercy of Donald Trump and the United States corporations. That will increase the wealth of a few at the expense of the many. When it comes to the crunch, Mr. Speaker, too many on the government benches who once opposed a no-deal outcome are now putting their own careers before the good of the people of this country. Just look at all those Tory leadership candidates who said it would be wrong to suspend Parliament in order to make no deal a reality, or more likely, but sit passively as their principles of just a few short weeks ago are cast aside. I don't know what they were doing over their summer holidays, but something changed. And it gets worse. Not only have they all stood by while the Prime Minister launches his latest attack on democracy, some have repeatedly refused to rule out the possibility that the government could ignore any law passed by Parliament which was attempting to stop a no-deal Brexit. So will the Prime Minister, when he responds in a moment, take the opportunity to assure the country that his government will abide by any legislation passed this week by this Parliament? The attack on our democracy in order to force through a disastrous no-deal Brexit is unprecedented, anti-democratic and unconstitutional. Labour will do all we can to protect our industry, protect our democracy, protect our people against this dangerous and reckless government. I condemn the rhetoric the Prime Minister used when he talked about a surrender bill. I hope he will reflect on his use of language. I really do hope he will reflect on his use of language. We're not surrendering because we're at war with Europe. They are surely our partners. If anything, it is a no-deal exit that would mean surrendering our industry, our jobs, surrendering our standards and protections in a trade deal with Donald Trump and the United States. Mr. Speaker, the UK should be using its position in the G7 to promote policies to tackle the climate emergency. The climate emergency is real, but instead of standing up to President Trump to save his blushes this time, it was in fact agreed there would be no joint communique on this at the G7. This is not leadership, this is fiddling while the Amazon burns. The situation across the Amazon should be a wake-up call to this Prime Minister, who once described global warming as primitive fear without foundation. As we watch fires rage, not only across the Amazon, but Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, does he stand by those sentiments? While funds to protect and restore the Amazon rainforests are welcomed, the Prime Minister knows this is merely a drop in the ocean. So will more money be pledged for the Amazon and are aiding, abetting and profiting from the destruction of the Amazon rainforest and indeed the rainforests in West Africa? The UK Parliament on May the 1st became the first state parliament anywhere in the world to declare a climate emergency, and I was proud to move that motion. We must continue to show global leadership on this issue. On Iran, Mr. Speaker, it's notable that the Prime Minister fails to condemn President Trump's decision to unilaterally tear up the internationally agreed Iran nuclear deal, creating this crisis which now risks a slide into even deeper conflict. Does the Prime Minister plan to work with European partners to restore the Iran nuclear deal and de-escalate tensions in the Gulf? We're clear that in government Labour would work tirelessly through the UN for a negotiated reinstatement of the nuclear deal and to defuse the threat of war in the Gulf. Effective diplomacy, not threats and bluster, must prevail. And will the Prime Minister call on the Iranian authorities to end the unjust detention of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe? And what actions has he taken so far to ensure her release from the terrible situation that she has been plunged into? Mr. Speaker, we're all concerned about the situation in Hong Kong. No government anywhere should get to shut down rights and freedoms or to pick and choose which laws it adheres to. Will he urge the Chinese government to stick to the Joint Declaration of 1984 and stand up for the rights of citizens in Hong Kong? Mr. Speaker, later today, this House has a last chance to stop this government from riding roughshod over constitutional and democratic rights in this country, so that a cabal in Downing Street can crash us out without a deal, without any democratic mandate and against the majority of public opinion. He isn't winning friends in Europe, he's losing friends at home. His is a government with no mandate, no morals, and as of today, no majority.
Mr. Speaker, The right honourable gentleman knows full well that this country has engaged actively with our European friends and partners, to make sense of the Iran nuclear deal and to ensure that that deal continues. And he will know that the FCO, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, continues to work actively to secure the release not just of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, but all the very sad consular cases that we are currently dealing with in Iran. I pay tribute to him and to the work of all his officials. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad for what he said about the importance of preserving democracy in Hong Kong, and he will observe the strength of the G7 statement on that matter. But quite frankly, when it comes to the bill that he is assisting in bringing forward tomorrow with the procedure that is coming forward tonight, Mr. Speaker, let us be in no doubt. This is a Benite, a former Benite opposite. I mean, he still is a Benite, I believe. He is a man who voted against every single piece of EU legislation. He voted against Maastricht. He voted against Lisbon time and time again. He has said that we must uphold the result of the EU referendum. Time and time again he has said that he's on the side of democracy and vindicating the will of the people. And what do we see now, Mr. Speaker? He has been converted with his hordes of momentum activists trying to take over the streets, converted into the agent of those who would subvert democracy and overturn the will of the people. He has become, that is what he wants to do. He wants to entrust the decision about how long this country remains in the European Union to our friends and partners in Brussels and not to this House. That is not democracy, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid that the right honourable gentleman opposite, inadvertently or not, has become the agent of further delay, further confusion, further uncertainty for business in this country and abroad. That is what he is prescribing. That is what he stands for. That is the result of his policy. And I urge everybody on all sides of the House not to support his approach. Let us go forward and not back with the honourable member opposite.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's extraordinary knockabout performance today merely confirms, it seems to me, his obvious strategy, which is to set conditions which make no deal inevitable, to make sure that as much blame as possible is attached to the EU and to this House for that consequence, and then as quickly as he can fight a flag-waving general election before the consequences of no deal become too obvious to the public. Perhaps my right honourable friend would let me know whether that clear explanation of his policy is one he entirely accepts. And does he also accept that if he gets his way and gets no deal, we then have to begin years of negotiations with the Europeans and the rest of the world about getting new trade, security, other arrangements in force? And does he seriously think that this approach will obtain from any other country in the world a free trade arrangement which is half as good as the common market which Conservative governments have helped put together over the years?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as he knows, I'm a keen fan and a lifelong fan.
I want to hear what the order. Sit down. Sit down. Yeah, I'm very grateful. I want to hear what the Prime Minister has to say in response to the question, and that response must be heard. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as the Father of the House knows, I'm a long-standing admirer of the right honourable member for Rushcliffe, and indeed I was the only member of the 2001 intake to vote for my right honourable friend as a leader of the Conservative Party. I was. A fact that I don't think he much thanked me for it at the time or since. But I've long been a fan of his, and indeed in many ways we are ad item in our views of what is it. And I agree with him, Mr. Speaker. I don't want an election. I don't want an election. We don't want an election. I don't think he wants an election, Mr. Speaker. By the way, as far as I can make it out, we don't want an election. We want to get the deal done. And the best way, Mr. Speaker, to get a deal is to support the government in the lobbies tonight.
Ian Blackford!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement? My goodness, this is the second time the Prime Minister's been at the dispatch box. This must be the shortest-lived honeymoon in parliamentary history. You simply have to look around the benches. He may say he doesn't want an election. His colleagues certainly don't want one, but I'll let him into a secret. We do. Because we want the people of Scotland to be able to have their say on this shambolic government. The Leader of the House talks about the strategy of the Prime Minister, and I have to say to him respectfully, when we hear use of the word collaborators, when we hear the use of the word surrender, the Prime Minister really should have some dignity and show some respect to the office that he temporarily holds. And of course, I think one of the most remarkable things that took place during the statement was to see the member for Bracknell cross the floor. Prime Minister, you've lost your majority. Mr. Speaker, over the weekend we saw commemorations across the world to mark the 80th anniversary of the Second World War, when brave citizens came together and stood together against tyranny. My thoughts and those of my party are with those who suffered, the veterans and their families. We should also recognise that the European Union is the legacy of 2 world wars that had ripped Europe apart. The European Union has been an important vehicle for peace and stability in Europe. Turning to the G7 summit, Mr. Speaker, I wish to express my shared concern at the unrest in Hong Kong. I also associate myself with the actions on climate change, on protecting the Amazon rainforest. But, Mr. Speaker, I do take issue. Furthermore, while the summit declared its support for progress in the UK, the President of the United States failed to challenge Russia's violation of international law in Ukraine. Another utterly disgraceful lack of leadership from the President of the United States. Mr. Speaker, following the summit, the Prime Minister displayed his own lack of leadership by moving to prorogue Parliament and strip power away from elected representatives, closing down Parliament by sending 3 Privy Councillors to instruct the Queen to sanction the closure of Parliament. 3 Privy Councillors acting on the instructions of the Prime Minister to shut down Parliament. Shame. Where is the democracy in that?
Ian Blackford there, leader of the SNP from Scotland, and we heard also, of course, from Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson. We're bringing you extended special coverage of proceedings in the House of Commons as the Commons resumes after the summer break to challenge Boris Johnson on his plan for a no-deal Brexit. It has been a very big day, and during Boris Johnson's first intervention there, we saw one MP from the Conservative Party cross the floor of the House, leave the Conservative Party and join one of the opposition parties, the Liberal Democrats. That effectively means that Boris Johnson has lost his majority. We are in for some surprises, I think, over the next few hours, with the opposition parties gathering together to try to take control of the House of Commons from the government and then try to pass a new law that would effectively delay this no-deal Brexit deadline that is scheduled for the end of October. Let's get some reaction to what's happened in the last hour or so with Ben Bradshaw, a Labour MP. Ben, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Just first of all, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has got no working majority. Philip Lee has crossed the floor. What does that mean?
Well, it means he's got no majority. But he didn't really have a majority before today anyway, because there are plenty of Conservative MPs who are absolutely horrified by the prospect of a crash-out no-deal Brexit, the damage it would do to British industry, to our economy, to the future of the United Kingdom, that they were prepared to vote with us to stop that happening anyway. And I think you saw a reminder there. People have forgotten what an abysmal House of Commons performer Boris Johnson is. He may have this kudos in the country, but he bombed as a backbench MP, bombed as a minister, and I think he's going to bomb that performance as Prime Minister too.
Well, you were part of this rebel group, if we can describe you like that, who are trying to bring in this new law. Do you know how many MPs will support this bid to block a no deal?
Well, so far I think about 15 or 16 Conservatives have said on the record they'd be prepared to. If you remember, we had a similar vote back in July to prevent Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament from then until the end of October, the extreme version of prorogation, and we won that by more than 40. And I think the threats that he has issued to long-standing senior Conservative politicians like Philip Chancellor, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister of this country, until a couple of months ago, to throw him out of the party, prevent him standing as a Conservative MP, this has just strengthened the resolve of these people who understand that now is the time to put our national interest first, as Churchill did in 1940 when we got rid of Chamberlain, and put the country first rather than the Tory party.
Speculation that Churchill's grandson could also be thrown out of the Conservative Party, but also a lot of criticism of Jeremy Corbyn in the past, and some blame going to him for the position that we're in. Is Mr Corbyn now going to block an election call by the Conservatives?
I'm confident that Labour will not vote for a general election that allows Boris Johnson to engineer a crash-out no-deal Brexit. There's nothing to stop Mr Johnson, even if we had a general election, or he promised a general election on October the 14th to change the date, and even if we had one on October the 14th, there's never been a general election in our recent history where there's been such a short time period from the general election to the first new law coming in. So we wouldn't have time to legislate against no deal after October the 14th or for anything else. So this is our last chance to stop a no deal Brexit. I'm hopeful and confident that we'll do it, and I'm also confident we will not fall into the trap of agreeing to a Boris Johnson general election.
But there could be an election this autumn if the no deal option is taken off the table. Are you and other people in the centre of the Labour Party going to go and campaign for a Corbyn Prime Minister?
I'm going to campaign for a Labour government and against a crash-out no-deal Brexit. That's what the choice will be that faces the British people in a general election. I would prefer a referendum, because I think to settle a binary question like this, it's much better to have a referendum, because all sorts of other issues come into a general election. But I'm confident the overwhelming majority of the British people do not want a crash-out no-deal Brexit. Any general election fought on that territory will be very good for Labour, and I'm confident we'd win it.
The key problem with your position, many will say, is that it doesn't lead to a solution. All you're doing is delaying Brexit. We've seen the divisions. You are perhaps risking the Brexit party, Nigel Farage's party, getting seats in the House of Commons. Is it not better to resolve this once for all? It's impossible to see a resolution and just accept no-deal Brexit and move on.
Oh, for goodness sake, no. I mean, no-deal Brexit would be so catastrophic for our country, for Ireland, the rest of Europe and the world, but particularly for Britain. It would throw thousands and thousands of British workers out of their jobs. It would decimate our agricultural industry, our health service, our public services. There's no way that I and other MPs are going to tolerate that. There is a way out of this. There are two ways. One's a general election, the other's a referendum. I think a referendum is the most sensible one, but if there's a general election, it's going to be on our terms, not Boris Johnson's.
Ben Bradshaw, thanks so much. Let's listen to Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor.
Kingdom. Could the Prime Minister now make a commitment to publish this afternoon the UK's proposals, so that those of us who are considering what to do later today can have had the benefit of seeing them? And will he further commit to transmitting those proposals without delay to the European Union?
Actually, as I told my right honourable friend this morning, the Chancellor Merkel was making an elementary point, which is that we could easily do a deal within 30 days, and we certainly shall. And what she also said is that there is no point in what my friends across the EU have said, is that there is no point in having a negotiation as long, beginning formal talks, as long as there is a risk that Parliament will make that negotiation impossible by taking away the ability of this country to negotiate. So every time we set out ideas, the first thing they ask, Mr. Speaker, is what will Parliament do? So I urge my friends tonight, I urge colleagues tonight to give us the leeway to get the deal that we need. It is very, very clear. The deal that can be done, the outlines of it are very clear. If members had been listening in my statement earlier, they would have heard the rough shape of what that deal can be, both in getting the alternative arrangements and in solving the problems of the Irish backstop. I'm afraid that by their actions, they're making the chances, I must regretfully say this to the House, they're making the chances of that deal less likely. We are working flat out to secure it, but the measures, if passed tonight, would make our prospects of success much less likely.
Hilary Benn!
Mr. Speaker, it's not just Chancellor Merkel who has confirmed that no substantive proposals have been put forward. Last weekend, the Irish Deputy Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Nothing credible has come from the British government," end of quote, on alternatives to the backstop. It's also reported that the Attorney General told the Prime Minister at the beginning of August that if he insisted on the removal of the backstop, it would inevitably result in no deal. Is that true? If it's true, can the Prime Minister try and persuade the House why it is credible to argue that progress is being made in the negotiations? Because there's a growing number of members who have come to the conclusion that what he really wants is a no-deal Brexit. And that is why many of us will try over the next 2 days to prevent that from happening in the national...
Mr. Speaker, the sad truth is there are many members in this House, and I'm afraid including the right honourable gentleman opposite, who simply want to block Brexit. And that's the truth. And they're using, that is the reality, and they are using the discussion of a so-called no-deal Brexit to conceal their real intentions. And by their measures tonight and tomorrow, they would be fatally undermining this government's ability to negotiate a deal. That is the reality. We can get a deal. We can remove the backstop, and he knows very well what this country needs to do because it's agreed on all sides of the House. The problem with the withdrawal agreement is not just a political declaration, it is the backstop. That makes agreement impossible on both sides of the House. But as long as this House is proposing motions such as the ones tonight and tomorrow, I'm afraid we have no chance of getting progress from our EU friends.
Mrs Anne Main.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What discussion did my right honourable friend have about the Green Climate Change Fund and what progress has been made, and can he give us an update?
Minister. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and we are indeed, as I said at the G7, if my memory serves me correctly, we are making a contribution of another £1.4 billion to the Green Climate Fund, and it is a high priority of this government.
Mr Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome what the Prime Minister has said about the backstop, because he knows, as well as the entire House knows, that is one of the fundamental reasons why the withdrawal agreement could not get through this House. Not only is it anti-democratic in the sense that laws would be made for the economy of Northern Ireland, and nobody in Belfast or London would have any say at all in the making of them or even ask questions about them, but it's also contrary to the principles that people say they believe in the Belfast Agreement and the St Andrews Agreement, which requires the consent of both communities, and no unionist party in Northern Ireland, any member of it, supports the backstop. Can I also welcome his commitment to a deal, because we are committed to getting a deal, a good deal for Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. And when he meets the Irish Prime Minister on Monday, which I welcome, can he convey to the Prime Minister, as we have tried to convey to him, that it would be entirely sensible and reasonable for him to sit down with us and other representatives of unionists in Northern Ireland for direct discussions, which would be very helpful in the current atmosphere, but which the Irish government has consistently, amazingly, refused to do. At the same time, preaching to others about the need for conciliation and movement and progress. So I appeal to the Prime Minister on the behalf of everyone in Northern Ireland, to try to get some momentum into discussions between the Irish Republic and Unionists in Northern Ireland on this vital issue.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his support, and he perfectly understands the issues, and he knows that he and I are at one in seeking to get rid of the backstop. And I believe that we can get rid of the backstop, and we can. They see they don't want to. They don't want to do it. We can make progress. We can make progress. We can make progress, but not if we take away. But not if we take away the possibility of no deal, which is what the right honourable gentleman is proposing to do, and not if we give the power. If we give the power infinitely to extend UK membership of the EU to Brussels, which is what his bill would do.
Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
Will the Prime Minister reflect on the fact that when the House of Commons debated the European referendum bill, it was passed with a majority of 6-1? When the House debated the European notification of withdrawal, it was passed 4-1 by this House. What does he think a further 3 or 6 month delay would achieve, other than betraying those people and those votes that we've already had?
I passionately agree with what my right honourable friend has just said, and I urge all those thinking tonight of and tomorrow of voting to extend again beyond October the 31st, exactly what they are seeking to do in that interval, and what the purpose of that extension would be. Believe me, the people in this country want to get on with it and want to come out.
Angela Eagle.
Speaker, I'm sure completely inadvertently the Prime Minister failed to answer a question that my right honourable friend put to him earlier, and that is that if a bill passes which makes it illegal to leave without a deal, will him and his government abide by the rule of law?
I'm grateful. We will, of course, uphold the Constitution and obey the law.
Jonathan Ginobili.
Given the huge amount of political repression going on in Russia at the moment, does my right honourable friend agree with President Trump that now is the right time to bring Russia back into the G7?
No, and I made that point very clearly at Biarritz.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to hear the Prime Minister say that he will uphold the Constitution and the rule of law, because of course it's essential that the United Kingdom upholds the rule of law for effective working with the G7 in future. So will he give this House his word that he and his government will respect legislation passed by this House and decisions made by the two legal jurisdictions in this Union, the jurisdictions in Scotland and the jurisdictions in England?
I refer the Honourable Lady the answer I gave just a moment ago.
John Whittingdale.
There you go. Will my right honourable friend confirm his determination to keep up the pressure on Russia, which continues to illegally occupy Crimea and whose involvement in the occupied territories in East Ukraine led to further deaths this weekend? Can I therefore strongly welcome his statement to the dispatch box just now that he agrees it is not appropriate for Russia to rejoin?
We're just going to pull away from that debate with John Whittingdale, a former minister, also asking a question, some of the questions going on to Russia. But of course, the day's news very much focused on Brexit, and Boris Johnson there being asked whether he will obey the law of the land. He said that we will obey the law and uphold the Constitution, although when he was asked about it for more clarity for a second question, he refused to give any more detail. Let's explain why that is a very important point here in these dramatic proceedings in the House of Commons. With me is Maddie Timot-Jack of the Institute of Government. And Maddie, first of all, in terms of what is happening today, Boris Johnson's just lost his working majority because a member of the Conservatives has crossed the floor. That means they've left the Conservative benches and crossed over to the other side of the Commons to sit with the Liberal Democrats. Does that affect the standing of the government?
But technically no. The only way that the government is no longer the government is if the House of Commons votes down the government and a vote of no confidence, which isn't what's happening at the moment. And I think what's really important about the fact that although they have technically lost their working majority, we already knew that quite a number of Conservative MPs were preparing to vote against the government both today and tomorrow. So actually, in terms of the proceedings around Brexit, it doesn't really change anything particularly, although obviously it was quite a dramatic moment chosen by Philip Lee as a very clear emergency debate motion. Now, this is usually something that doesn't do very much. It's just an opportunity for MPs to debate an issue, but they're going to do something very different with it. So they plan to take control of the Commons agenda tomorrow to be able to introduce their own bill. And what they're also doing today with this motion, they're not only taking control of time tomorrow, but they're also programming out how we'll get through the bill stages tomorrow. So they're going to rattle through them very quickly to ensure that they can get the bill through the House of Commons. This is the bill that would sort of try and stop a no-deal exit on the 31st of October. They're trying to get it through the Commons so that it can go to the Lords, so they can try and pass the bill before Parliament is suspended next week.
Maddie Jack, thanks very much indeed. The question is whether the government would listen to a change in the law. Boris Johnson saying they would, but of course there are many turns of the dice ahead in the coming hours and days. So we'll be back with more in a few minutes. Stay with us. This is BBC World News Live at Westminster.
Hello. Well, let's get a check on the Bahamas and Florida first of all, and Hurricane Dorian. So not much has changed in the last 24 hours. The eye is still pounding one of the islands there in the Bahamas, Grand Bahama. The storm has been almost stationary. That means that the storm surge and the high winds, the catastrophic winds, have been affecting the island for that much longer, a lot longer than you'd normally expect. And the storm centre is expected to brush the coast of Florida over the next couple of days, bringing some high winds and heavy rain, but the worst should stay out to sea. But let's have a look at the weather across Europe now. And here's Wednesday on the eastern side there, southeast of Europe. You can see a lot of sunshine there for Turkey, for Greece, some showers there close to Bucharest. But generally, much of the Mediterranean is looking absolutely fine. Beautiful hot weather there in Lisbon, 35 degrees if you like the heat. Warm weather for southern parts of France, but starting to feel a little bit more like autumn there across Scotland, for example, and western parts of Norway, as we're seeing these weather systems coming in, bringing quite cool air from the north. But Thursday across Europe, temperatures only 19 in Paris, some warm weather there in Warsaw at around 26 degrees. Let's have a look at a selection of cities over the coming days. If you want hot sunshine, summertime weather, well, it's Madrid and Rome.
Others can deliver food to your door, but can they bring fist bumps and high fives? Can they cause mini stampedes? Bring you instant hero status? Or turn back time with the turn of a knob? Others can bring you food. We bring you a little more. Delivering happy. McDonald's on Uber Eats.
We've been told that perfect mornings exist for the lucky few. That morning people own the waking hours. But the truth is, mornings belong to all of us. And while your morning might look like this, or even this, your mornings are what you make of them. All it takes is saying yes. Starbucks Morning Yes.
I'm Geetha Gurumuthy, live at Westminster, where the UK government has just lost its working majority. Philip Lee, a prominent pro-European, defected to an opposition party just as the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was preparing to speak. It comes as a cross-party group of MPs attempt to take control of the agenda in order to thwart Mr Johnson's plans for Britain to leave the EU with or without a deal at the end of October.
To force us to beg for yet another pointless delay. If that happens, all the progress that we have been making will have been for nothing.
Opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn says it's increasingly becoming clear the Prime Minister wants to leave the EU without a deal. Well, this is the scene in the House of Commons at the moment where the debate has already been intense.
One other headline, Hurricane Dorian kills at least 5 and causes chaos in the Bahamas as the mammoth storm hovers over the area. Satellite images reveal the scale of flooding in the Bahamas, and the Prime Minister says it's devastating for the archipelago.
We are in the midst of a historic tragedy in parts of our northern Bahamas. Our mission and focus now is search, rescue, and recovery.
Another momentous day here in Westminster as MPs from the British Prime Minister's own party look set to join forces with opposition MPs to try to block a no-deal Brexit. If defeated, Boris Johnson has threatened to try and call the UK's third general election in 4 years, which could come as soon as the middle of next month. Boris Johnson has been speaking in the Commons in the last hour, where he's repeated that he would refuse to ask Brussels for an extension to Brexit. Well, in a dramatic move just before Mr Johnson began to speak, the Conservative MP Philip Lee, a prominent pro-European, crossed the floor. That means he left the governing party and he defected to the opposition. Well, joining the Liberal Democrat Party will mean now that Boris Johnson has lost his wafer-thin parliamentary majority. Let's speak now to Rob Watson, our UK parliamentary correspondent, political correspondent. Rob, it started in dramatic form.
It certainly has, and I thought, seeing as you've just mentioned Philip Lee, I'd just read a bit of what he said in his letter of resignation. This Conservative government is aggressively pursuing a damaging Brexit in unprincipled ways. It is putting lives and livelihoods at risk unnecessarily, and it is wantonly endangering the integrity of the United Kingdom. And you have to think, hang on a minute, if that's people on your own side, you really have a problem. And I think that it just highlights this particular issue for the governing Conservative Party, a party that has been a broad church. I mean, it is now under deep, deep strains. I mean, I think it is not an exaggeration to say it's in a state, really, of civil war over Brexit.
And yet, what is happening today is that members of the Conservative Party could join with the Labour and Liberal Democrats and other opposition parties to try to stop a no-deal Brexit. And we then have this very complex question of whether there's going to be an election or not.
Absolutely. So there are 3 things going on. One is that the future of the governing Conservative Party. It's an immensely important question. But then, yes, there are these 2 others which are connected to that. The first is the future of Brexit. You know, is there going to be Brexit on 31st of October? And we're seeing this attempt by opposition MPs with help from some Conservatives, some who've now crossed over into other parties, to try and rule out the idea of a no-deal Brexit on October the 31st, to postpone it if there hasn't been an agreement. And they'll probably succeed. The second big question is who on earth is going to be governing the UK? Who is supposed to be in charge? Because, of course, the Prime Minister has said, look, if I lose these votes, if MPs do rule out basically the option of a no-deal Brexit, I want an election and I want it soon. I mean, I suspect we're going to get some certainty about that first issue. I think these rebel MPs probably will just about do it. I think what we're not clear about is if there is going to be a general election, when on earth will it be? Because, of course, the opposition parties are saying to Mr Johnson, not so fast, We want to see the fine print before we agree to a general election on any particular date.
Just briefly, there was also a story today about whether the British government is actually putting forward a proper negotiation with the EU. Is there any possibility of a real deal happening in the middle of October?
Well, of course, the Conservative government is trying to say, yes, we are, because they want to stop people joining the rebellion. But EU sources have told the BBC that
today, the former Conservative Chancellor Philip Hammond received cheers from opposition benches when he rose to speak in the Commons in the last few minutes, and he asked Boris Johnson what his deal, if he gets a new deal, would actually look like.
My right honourable friend has assured me that he's very keen to get a deal with the European Union. But last Friday, Chancellor Merkel of Germany observed somewhat acerbically that 9 days into the 30 days that the Prime Minister had requested during his visit to Berlin, she hadn't yet seen any proposals from the United Kingdom. Could the Prime Minister now make a commitment to publish this afternoon the UK's proposals so that those of us who are considering what to do later today can have had the benefit of seeing them? And will he further commit to transmitting those proposals without delay to the European Union?
Actually, as I told my right honourable friend this morning, the Chancellor Merkel was making an elementary point, which is that we could easily do a deal within 30 days, and we certainly shall. And what she also said is that there is no point in what my friends across the EU have said, is that there is no point in having a negotiation beginning formal talks, as long as there is a risk that Parliament will make that negotiation impossible by taking away the ability of this country to negotiate. So every time we set out ideas, the first thing they ask, Mr. Speaker, is what will Parliament do? So I urge my friends tonight, I urge colleagues tonight to give us the leeway to get the deal that we need.
Boris Johnson there asking for support from his own members, but Philip Hammond and even Nicholas Soames, the grandson of Winston Churchill, has said they will not vote with the government tonight, and Boris Johnson is saying that if they don't, they could be expelled from the Conservative Party. The numbers of rebels are big, and that is an extraordinary proposition. Well, the British opposition party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, says it is becoming clear that the government wants to leave without a deal.
It's becoming increasingly clear that this reckless government only has one plan: to crash out of the EU without a deal. The reality is exposed today in the in-house journal of the Conservative Party, otherwise known as the Daily Telegraph, which reports the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff calling negotiations a sham. Reports that the strategy is to, quote, run down the clock, and that the proposal to alter the backstop is a complete fantasy. And those are the words of the Attorney General.
Jeremy Corbyn there. Well, many are speculating that we are going to have an election one way or another this autumn. Let's speak to Chris Curtis, who is the political research manager of the polling firm YouGov. Chris, whether we get an election on October the 14th, as Number 10 have briefed, or at some point after that, where do the parties stand now? What would a new parliament look like?
Well, all we can do as pollsters is look at where the public currently are and maybe say a little bit about the direction the wind's blowing. So when we look at the current polling numbers, how the British public say they'd vote if there was a general election tomorrow, Boris Johnson has quite a large and I'd say comfortable lead. Our most recent opinion poll showed that Boris Johnson, the Conservatives, had an 11-point lead over the Labour Party, and when you ask who would make the best Prime Minister, Boris Johnson has an even larger lead over Jeremy Corbyn. Now, if there were a general election in these but more than making up for those losses by gaining off the main opposition party here, the Labour Party. The difficulty with that analysis, of course, is that that's still before an election campaign, and politics is very volatile at the moment, and all of that is still subject to change depending on the events of tonight and depending on the events of the coming weeks.
And we should say that such predictions have not always turned out to be translated into seats at elections, even in the past.
Well, if we take the 2017 general election, for example, Theresa May went into that election with a very large lead in the polls, much larger than Boris Johnson's lead is today. And she also went into that election when asked who was the best Prime Minister, absolutely thrashing Jeremy Corbyn on that metric. And yet, over the course of that campaign, that lead in the polls completely disappeared. So when people are thinking about potentially voting for a general election tomorrow, it's important to remember whilst Boris Johnson has a lead today, that doesn't mean that he would necessarily still have a lead on October the 14th or even whenever election day ends up being.
And part of the change in British politics is that you've got sort of low levels of support almost for across a number of parties, and Jeremy Corbyn is a much more left-wing leader than traditional Labour Party figures. What happens now if a number of Conservatives are expelled? Let's say a lot of them join the Lib Dems, for example, or a new independent grouping. So how would that affect things?
So Boris Johnson's lead, I like to think of it as being a bit like a three-legged stool. Basically, what he's reliant on is a fairly united Leave vote behind the Conservatives, and a divided Remain vote behind the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party. And then the third leg of that stool is an electoral system that basically punishes that division amongst the Remain vote and rewards that unity behind the Conservatives. The thing is, if you can knock out one of those legs, suddenly Boris Johnson's victory in a potential general election doesn't look so easy. So it could be that Leave vote divides again. For example, a resurgent Brexit party. We've obviously heard a lot about the Brexit party here in the UK. Alternatively, the Remain vote could unite behind a particular party. It could be the Labour Party, or if we see more defections to the Liberal Democrats this evening, maybe that sets a narrative that the Lib Dems are the best party to vote for and the Remainers unite behind them. Alternatively, and we're hearing a lot of discussion about this at the moment, the first past the post electoral system here in the UK, the way we elect our MPs to Parliament, what could happen is the Remainers could try and get around the problems they currently face with that system. So that could be, for example, encouraging members of the public to tactical vote. If the Lib Dems have a better chance of winning here, vote Lib Dem. If Labour have a better chance of winning here, vote Labour. Or it could be through arrangements or pacts between the parties. So we've been hearing about the Green Party potentially standing aside in some seats for the Liberal Democrats, and arrangements like that in place. So basically the parties will be trying to knock out one of those three legs of Boris Johnson's stool, the stool that's currently giving Boris Johnson that. The analogy is falling apart, but that's the way that an election campaign could lead to a situation where Boris Johnson's lead no longer looks so comfortable.
OK, fascinating. Chris Curtis, thanks very much indeed for explaining that. Boris Johnson, many think, does want an election because he's now lost his majority and he wants to get a majority in order to govern comfortably. The opposition are obviously not wanting to give him that. They are worried that if we have an early election that he could actually change the date and somehow crash Britain out at the end of October by shifting the date of the election from mid-October till after the end of October. But there's a lot of uncertainty about what is legitimate and what tactics we will see from all sides going forward in the coming hours and days. Much more to come here from Westminster. Now let's take a break and Matthew will be back in a few moments.
In Ukraine's vast exclusion zone, cut off after the world's worst nuclear disaster, people still live on contaminated land. 33 years on, is it now safe to build a future here? Our world, in the shadow of Chernobyl, on BBC World News.
Welcome back to today's Global. Now, it's one of the most powerful Atlantic storms ever recorded, and Hurricane Dorian looks set to cause even more destruction to the Bahamas in the next few hours. That's because the storm is moving so slowly it is virtually stationary. The scale of the damage is now beginning to emerge, with large areas of the country, including a major airport, flooded. So far, 5 people are known to have died as a result of the storm, but it's feared the true figure could be far higher. Now, the US National Hurricane Center says that Dorian is slowing, making its way to the east coast of America. It will reach land in the coming days. Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina, all declaring states of emergency, with many people evacuated. So let's catch up with the latest from Florida, and Gary O'Donoghue is there for us. And Gary, just give us a sense of what it is like there.
Well, there's been here, I'm on Daytona Beach, which is, if you imagine Florida, a sort of long, thin Florida sticking down north-south into the Atlantic. It's about halfway up the right-hand side of that. And so the storm is off the coast here, about 100 miles off the coast and a bit further south. And it has weakened slightly in the last few hours, but it's also got bigger in terms of diameter. So the winds are now spreading out further from the eye. And we're getting, as you can see here, we're getting sort of squally rain, pretty unpleasant conditions. But these are really just the outer fringes of the storm, really the gentlest bit of it. And the Bahamas, of course, have had it sitting on top of them for nearly, well, getting in towards 2 days entirely, and a day and a half for that northwest part of the island chain. But it is now moving at 2 miles an hour, moving northwest. We still think, according to the hurricane people, that it will track its way up the eastern seaboard, but there still could be some pretty big flooding in places like Florida and Georgia. And there's still, the authorities here are telling people to stay away from those evacuated counties along the coast.
All right, Gary, we'll be back to you later in the programme. Thanks very much for now. Let's speak to Clint Watson from Eyewitness News. He's in the capital of the Bahamas. Clint, we spoke this time yesterday. What has it been like in the last 24 hours?
It's been rough. It's been rough, but of course we're still working hard at it, making things happen. The capital continues to have these sprawls of rainfalls and rain showers, and today it's even worse to the fact that there's so much flooding in the capital. Persons can't even get out of their homes. I was on my way to pick up my cameraman and just couldn't get to his corner because of severe flooding. That's what we're having in the capital because of the sprawls from this storm. And yet our brothers and sisters to the north in Abaco and Grand Bahama continue to experience conditions there. The good thing about it in Grand Bahama, which was under the gun perhaps now for more than 24 hours, is the fact that there was some lightening up of the winds. And so what it did was, because of the lightening of the winds, and when the winds were heavy, it allowed some of the water to run off. And so rescuers were able to leave headquarters and go and rescue some people because of the period they had. So that was a good thing.
Clint, I know you're out and about. This time yesterday you were unable to be out, but tell me what you've seen, because I saw you quoted as saying that you've seen video of people trapped in their attics with water at that level. Is it still like that?
It's been unbelievable. On the island where it was being hit, Grand Bahama, it's been like that overnight. Many people keeping that throughout the night. Now, the good thing about it is there's been a window. And so that window has allowed rescuers to go in and get those people. The window has allowed people to go in and get people out of those attics and take them to safety. So while the water is subsiding, we've been told by meteorologists that there only is a short window and there's going to be another surge of rainfall that will take the water back up. So while it's settled some, it's allowed people to get out before that next rainfall comes in.
Just give me a final thought on the sort of help you think the Bahamas will need and whether any of it so far has actually arrived.
we're going to need massive help from everybody because of the various islands that have been affected. Already help has come in. The U.S. Coast Guard was in yesterday, airlifting people out of Abaco to the capital who needed medical attention, and they're going to be back in there again today. People through South Florida and Canada already coordinating relief efforts to bring planes and helicopters with relief efforts. So it's going to be a unified effort that's needed worldwide to be able to help the many people that are in need.
Well, Clint Watson, thanks so much for taking time to talk to us once again and give us that very, very clear update of what it is like trapped in the middle of Dorian. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Now, let's return very much to our main news and what is going on at Westminster, because we've been watching that debate with Boris Johnson in the last hour and a half. Let me just show you the live pictures from the chamber. It has been fascinating. It started with Philip Lee, the Conservative MP, crossing the floor, joining the Liberal Democrats, wiping out the Conservative majority of one. Now, Boris Johnson has urged those rebels not to support that bill. He said the opposition wants to beg for another pointless extension. All the progress we've made with the negotiations, he said, would be for nothing. Under no circumstances will I accept anything like that. Jeremy Corbyn saying and asking the Prime Minister, have the UK put forward any new proposals on the backstop? He then went on to talk about the perils of no deal, food shortages, reduced medical supplies, chaos, and said this government is hiding from scrutiny and their true intentions, which was a general election. A government, he said, of cowardice. That debate's still in full flow. We're back with Geeta in Westminster on Global here in a moment or two. Don't go away.
It's now time for Trending Travel, our regular pick of the top photos, videos, and stories all happening online this week.
The chance for you to legally climb Uluru is officially and quickly coming to an end. October the 26th this year is the date that's been chosen to ban people from climbing the World Heritage listed site, which is also one of the planet's most recognizable natural landmarks and a sacred site for the local people. But just remember, you'll no longer be able to climb it after the 26th of October. Is this